Angel Rodriguez is another pt.4 board member, and he has been here in the upstate for a number of years, and he's one of those small business owners who has found a niche and is really doing some great things here in the upstate. You may have seen his folks out front with their work that they're doing. So we're very pleased to have Angel involved, and he and Jim have really been spearheads of this forum and this topic for us. And so Angel is going to lead our second panel, which is really cool. You know, there's so many great innovations and things happening in the upstate. I mentioned the Greenwood Genetics Center. We had a group down there a couple months ago. We had someone from there at our forum back in November. All the other, there's just so many wonderful things from a science standpoint happening here in the upstate. We're very pleased to have 3 representatives of some of the great things happening. And Angel, we appreciate you leading the discussion.
Thank you. Thanks again, Dean. As Dean mentioned, I came here as an entrepreneur about 6 years ago to start my company. I have a background in banking, and I came here to start a company in the medical health field because it was of interest to me. I had some family members involved in the industry as well, and I chose Greenville specifically. This is a place that I'm originally from, Ohio. I spent some time in Florida, and I had a chance through the banking, in my past life in banking, to come to Furman University for a graduate program, and I just fell in love with Greenville. And hopefully we'll hear a little bit of that from our other entrepreneurs talking about why they chose Greenville to start their companies. Also, as Dean mentioned, my company is a medical device company, and this particular topic is near and dear to my heart because we have a vision for providing progressive products for the improvement of medicine and patient care as well. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask the members to introduce themselves first, and then we really want this to be more of an interactive discussion. You will have a chance for Q&A so that you might have an opportunity to ask questions of them as well. And I encourage the panel to speak back and forth. This is really awkward. I'm kind of leaning, screen. I wish I could move it. Can I move this up a little? That way it's a little more interactive, right? As Dean also mentioned, many of us are very familiar with the Greenwood Genetics Center, Clemson University's bioengineering leadership, and of course the many world-class hospital programs throughout our region. But how many of us are aware of the cutting-edge science that's being developed by entrepreneurs, creating business opportunities, jobs here in the upstate, while impacting the entire world? In an effort to showcase some of those inventive health solutions, I'm pleased to introduce 3 pioneers in innovative technologies in the area of cancer treatment and care. Our first panelist, closest to me, is Dr. Melanie Thomas, who is the Associate Center Director of Experimental Therapeutics at the Gibbs Cancer Center and Research Institute. Next to her is Dr. Matthew Gevaert, PhD Chief Executive Officer of Kiatech, Inc. Last but not least, see, I told you I couldn't see you over there, is Michael Bolick, Chief Executive Officer of Silo Genomics. If I could, Dr. Thomas, I'd like to introduce you first and just share a little bit about yourself and your organization, and we'll continue down the path there.
Is this on? I'll let tell.
I think I can.
I need a technologist. There we go. Is that good?
Yes.
Could someone open the back door? Isn't it really hot in here?
Yes.
Is there any way to do that? So my 90 seconds. So I'm a medical oncologist, meaning I do chemotherapy, not surgery, not radiation, etc. I trained at MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston and was there for a total of 9 years. So as part of that, I just became passionate about clinical trials and doing everything possible on an individual level and an institutional level to make clinical trials available for my patients and my colleagues' patients. Because of a fact that you probably don't know is of all newly diagnosed adult patients with cancer in a given year in the United States, only 3 to 4% of them go on clinical trials. And all of the treatments that you all have been talking about, you read about in the news and so forth, that is the funnel. There is one funnel, there's one pathway to FDA approval, and that's through about 12 years of clinical trials actually. So that's really a tiny number of patients. And there's many, many reasons for that. But actually in the upstate, and I was gonna say, I didn't start Gibbs Cancer Center for sure, and don't live in Greenville. I live in Spartanburg, but we're all part of one big community. But actually, our cancer center and Spartanburg Regional are really on the cusp of a number of things. I think you're going to hear about some of the incredible science that it is really a tidal wave coming into all of medicine, but specifically into oncology. And there's something like 800 new molecules in various stages of early testing. And yet, how do you get those 800, potentially exciting and life-changing molecules into 3% of the patients, and expect that to be converted into approvals and successes in a reasonable time frame? And that alone, that slow, tedious process, definitely is part of underpins the high cost of many of these medications. So we're doing a number of things at Gibbs to try to revolutionize, really is not too strong a term, how we bring clinical trials to patients. And that's, for many of these exciting drugs, where do you have to go? Memorial Sloan Kettering. Greenville actually has a very robust early phase development program, but New York or somewhere else. And for many people, especially in a poor state like South Carolina, they can't travel. So we're doing a lot of things to really flip that around and bring the exciting trials to the local area so that people don't have to travel, to sort of democratize the trial process.
If I could, I'd like you to introduce yourself, just a little bit about your organization, Michael, if you could.
Okay.
And then we'll continue forward. And what you're doing, some of the innovation and science that you're bringing to the
You
market.
did it right before now. Maybe you need it.
Good afternoon. My name is Michael Bolick. I'm the CEO of Sela Genomics. I'm really excited to hear about the developments all around us. I'm going to speak a little bit about our history. We started as a Sela with a Clemson startup. We licensed technology from Clemson in 2006. And I won't take you through all the perturbations, but basically, if you translation to today, basically we're owned by a British diagnostics firm, and we're very well capitalized, which is a nice change. We're going to be able to say that. But the really exciting part for me is now we have the opportunity to do some things that we envisioned doing over the last several years, and I'll describe to you quickly for you. In partnership with the Greenville Health System, where we operate a clinical genomics center alongside my partner Matt here, we've developed a new next generation sequencing assay for advanced stage colon cancer patients. Now we see that as really important because the clinicians have told us very clearly that there's targeted therapies that my compatriot here mentioned that are targeted based on genetic signatures. But if you can't afford to get the genetic test, you don't get access to standard of care. So about 2 weeks ago, we announced across the nation. I just got back from ASCO in Chicago this week. We had a nice little bit of buzz.
You look much more rested than most of us who just.
Yeah, it was a nice weekend for us because we announced a sub $1,000 next generation test for this type of application. Now, I want to be careful not to say that this is the only test like this in the country, but it's the first one we think is commercially available. We've designed it specifically to provide the doctors the oncogene information that they need to be able to guide those standard of care therapies without overloading the boat with a bunch of genetic markers that can't really help in the short term. So our report is actually divided up into two parts. First is those genes that could guide towards standard of care targeted therapy for colon cancer patients, advanced stage colon cancer patients. But then the second part of the report is exactly what she just mentioned, which is those other genes which could guide the patient towards clinical trials. Instead of them just guessing or surfing the internet, I mean, imagine Google and
Getting
you
on
got
an
colon
airplane
cancer.
and going somewhere.
So it specifically can guide you toward those. So we're really excited about that announcement. The second thing Dr. Sinopoli mentioned earlier is this transition towards avoiding the disease state. So we're this summer moving from oncology, also into cardiovascular disease, with some risk assays that we're selling into corporate wellness to specifically allow companies that are paying for their own insurance to help make the decision to avoid the disease state rather than waiting until it occurs. So we'll be making some announcements later this summer around a test to avoid heart attacks, and the last test in that regime in a suite of assays that I'm particularly excited. Please don't judge me, but it's weight loss. It's a genetic test that allows you to determine how you can most effectively lose weight. So it feeds directly into dietary practices. We searched a long time over the course of several years to find not just risk assays, but as was mentioned earlier, a risk assay with some specific things that you can do in response to identifying risk. So we'll talk more later. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bolick. Dr. Gevaert.
Thank you. Just a quick comment before I start about me. I learned an important secret for successfully talking to a packed room. One is talk after Thornton Kirby, and two is be sandwiched between him and refreshments. So appreciate y'all being here. I'm Matt Gevaert, CEO of Kiatech. This is an interesting panel, and actually we got a great setup by the people before us to really sort of set the stage for what are we doing in the trenches, frankly, on one of the most important disease states and affecting disease states that we all in the room face, and that's cancer. So all three of us have that in common, and from the clinical side, and then Michael and I from the commercial side, and we're both really in the trenches, trying to make it different for cancer patients out there. Michael and I are a nice duo because we actually are trying to get the same goal, but we have two very different approaches. So his approach is based on genetics and the information you can get from that. Our approach works at a different level, and that's at live cells. So in a nutshell, what we're trying to do is change the conversation between cancer doctors and their patients about drug selection, which actually was referred to specifically before. You know, Mrs. Jones, who's sick, or Peggy, or whatever her name is, says, you know, what drug am I going to get and why? And right now, that answer, to the best of everyone's ability, with the best data, is still based on statistics. So there'll be a best guess to say, okay, this is the first best guess. And then if it doesn't work, we'll try something different. And what we want to do by using cancer patients' live cells is actually based that not on statistics, but on data that came from the treatment of those cells. So keep those cells alive, grow them in our labs, treat them with the drugs that Mrs. Jones or Peggy could get, and actually be able to correlate so that the doctor could say, with a foreknowledge of her response, I'm going to give you this one because you're in the 60% who respond to it. Or I'm going to give you that one because you're not in the 60% who respond to first-line treatment. And so therefore, we're going to walk down the path that way. And it's a neat thing that I get to do every morning, is get up and try to create that world. Because eventually it'll blow into the world that Thornton described, which is a world that has to consider cost and wise utilization of resources. And so, you know, it becomes a win-win-win when we can only give patients drugs that they're going to respond to. We can avoid all the side effects, we can get better outcomes, and we can save money. So that's my 90-second thing.
I joked with them earlier that they only had 90 seconds to introduce themselves and their company. This is their Shark Tank opportunity. I read somewhere that Mr. Wonderful, O'Neill is his name, I can't remember his first name, but apparently he said that his advice was you had 90 seconds to sell a room, and if you couldn't do it in 90 seconds, he wasn't interested. So thank you very much for handling that piece, I appreciate it. Since who has the mic now, Dr. Thomas, wonderful. It sounds like you're ready to say something already. Go ahead, please. 90 seconds wasn't enough?
Of course not. I guess I thought maybe if I could have 30 seconds, because it can be really hard to understand. I mean, I include myself. What does all this genomics and all this sort of mean? Is there anyone in the room who's ever been touched by cancer, or either been through treatment yourself or had a family member? So and of those who's gotten, you know, chemotherapy, sort of traditional chemotherapy, okay? So you know, it's a lot of side effects and so forth. Well, all those chemotherapy drugs, they're not going away. They've been the stalwart of our treatment for 50 years, but they really are sort of drive-by shooting. I mean, most of our chemotherapy drugs basically go in the body, and then they're looking around for cells that are trying to divide, which cancer cells obviously are, and they somehow interfere with that. Well, that's pretty non-specific, right? You have other cells that are trying to divide, your bone marrow cells, your hair follicles, the lining of your GI tract. And so that's what I mean by drive-by shooting. And when drugs get approved by the FDA, and frankly, we have the best FDA process in the world, I believe. But you know, they're based on large studies, population studies, and statistically significant improvements in survival. Again, that's very, very general. So truthfully, with the exception of certain very discrete diseases, in the vast majority of cancers that we're all familiar with, you know, probably 80% of the patients, in fact, don't benefit. And many patients go through months and another, you know, another round and another round and another round. And we in oncology have not done a very good job, or we haven't done it at all, actually, of what was mentioned in the earlier panel. And this is not an easy topic, but to somehow say what is either a life extension benefit or an improvement in quality of life benefit that can be quantified of giving those treatments. In other countries, they do that. In England, there are many drugs that we believe in here, but they just don't give because of the cost benefit. So Fast forward to the Human Genome Project, which was accomplished over 10 years and many billions of dollars, and it was completed, gosh, about 10 years ago. It was probably one of the best expenditures of federal money that's ever been done. And so and all those results are now open source and available to anyone. So everyone has been able to essentially mine that data and extend it. The Human Genome Project really mapped out, well, what do normal bodies look like? So now if we can understand what tumors look like and rheumatologic diseases and other things, then that is what they are all doing, is optimizing that and leveraging it into, all right, what's wrong with this person's cancer? And can we pick a drug or design a drug against this person's cancer and not ovarian cancer or lung cancer? I'm sorry, that's longer than 30 seconds, but hopefully it put in context this revolution.
No, I appreciate that. That was helpful for me as well. Michael, you're about to grab the mic, and I actually...
No, he was keeping it from
He was keeping it from you. Taking it from you. Michael, I guess, what patient population does your technology impact specifically?
Well, it would vary based on the test that we're speaking of, but I'll speak to Precision Path first. Again, we chose to announce specifically for advanced stage colon cancer patients because they have the largest population of targeted therapies and standard of care. And what I mean by that is if you don't have the genetic information, if your doctor doesn't have the genetic information, you don't get access to the drugs. And they're not all, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Some of them are highly effective, and all you need to know is that you could or could not process the drug effectively. So the challenge that we're all faced, at least this side of the table, and actually all three of us are faced with, is reimbursement, right? So, there's other tests in the market that do this that are 300 and 400 genes, and they cost $6,000. So what we did was we focused specifically down on a smaller subset of genes, so hence the term precision path, to get the doctors the information they needed specifically for these advanced stage colon cancer patients. Now, over the next 6 months, we have 5 other sites of origin that are coming online. Just one quick point to follow up on what she was speaking on earlier is this idea of site of origin. You hear people say they got colon cancer or breast cancer, and you got all these ribbons. And, I believe within 5 years
less.
You're not going to. I don't know how we're going to describe it. We're going to talk about a gene mutation.
You'll be a PI3 kinase KRAS. You'll be described by your set of mutations. We're beginning it now.
So what's happening is, if you understand the genetics and the proteomics of the cancer, you're much more likely to pick a more precise medicine. You hear this term, people that have followed the industry have heard a lot about personalized medicine. The last few years, even the president spoke about precision medicine. It's because the idea of a personalized medicine means you're going to make a drug just for me, and that's a long ways off. But we can make drugs that are much more effective for 80% of a certain population of cancers of a certain profile, right? You may find that your breast cancer, quote unquote, is actually like a colon cancer, and therefore a colon cancer drug could be potentially utilized for your breast cancer. Now, in our standard of care, and we do have a very strong healthcare system, so I don't mean to criticize at all. So, entrepreneur, not a doctor guy. But imagine the day when you have access to a drug because your profile matches, and you don't have to wait till you've gone through all these options to get access to that drug. But that's the day that's really exciting. And we can throw rocks at Gilead, but hepatitis is an example where we didn't have tools, right? And targeted therapies have just emerged. It was mentioned earlier, get more competition. You have more of these clinical trials and you push more drugs on the market, the doctors have more choices. And Gilead will have to drop their price.
Thank you. If you don't have anything to add to that, I do have one question for you. And then I want to open it up to the room for 5 or so minutes, and then we can go ahead and get our refreshments. I know I could use something to drink. What were some of the challenges or barriers for your product, in bringing that to market? Or maybe you could speak to, what was it that really drove your desire to develop these products?
Well, so basically, I guess I'll take the last one first, and the desire is inborn in every entrepreneur, I think, who thinks that they can make the world a better place than it is, or they're frustrated and it needs to change, or there's a desire to change, which I think, is in everybody, but some people act out on it more than others. I guess we're the actors out. It's a balance of yeah. So that was really the desire to change, and it came from, in my case, a desire that was born in my graduate work at Clemson and in the PhD program in biomedical engineering. It was really actually not about cancer, but it was about the way that we grow cells and how much more information we can get out of them, how much more useful they would be if we changed them. That was my desire for change, which, as it unfolded over time, resulted in our focus in cancer, because cancer was absolutely the place that needed us to go and deploy our tools quickest, biggest opportunity for impact, biggest need, sort of that right combination. What was interesting, and just sort of as I get more gray hair and get to look back on time, people say, "What did you do right?" And I say, we actually stayed alive long enough for the wave to catch us. So, the art of being an entrepreneur is being ahead of the curve, but not too far ahead of the curve. We were probably too far ahead of the curve, so we had to wait around a little bit longer than other people. But now the wave has really caught us, and we're involved in a national conversation about the kinds of things that we do, and we're getting a very, very good response. So this is an exciting time for us, as a result, I guess it's just rewarding to be here to talk about the fact that this is really developing at a very rapid pace, and we're in parallel developing all the tools that we need to realize changes to the way that cancer drugs are given up.
All right, so we have a choice here. I have 10 questions I'm going to ask, or you can ask your question. So I see that Michael has a question in the back.
All right, so here's my question specifically for Michael and Matt. As you talk about your companies, you just mentioned that you're fully capitalized. For the
you mentioned that, no.
Okay. Well, you're going to get the wave's going to catch up with you, sir. So for the 10 to the top in our region, do we have the infrastructure as it relates to lab and other types of public resources, as well as the capital to allow for more companies like Gevaert and Sila to be here in the upstate in this region? Or do you see that there are deficiencies, and if so, what are those?
When I first started my first company, the answer to that would be there's not enough capital. No question. You always need more capital. But I will say, as Matt mentioned, being early to the game, honestly, when I first started my first company, we were too immature to raise capital. And as we went along, ultimately we attracted merger and acquisition target opportunities. I think we can always improve access to capital. And Matt and I've been involved with SC Bio, and there's a number of folks in the room that have helped us to try to change the landscape for capital, and it's a continuum. It's from angel investors all the way through to VC and then private equity. I mean, you got John Warner here was one of the first VC guys in the community, but since then we really haven't had a local VC that would take a risk. Now we're starting to see exits, and so as a result, you're starting to see that greed fear switch over to the, I wouldn't say greed, I'll say the profiting opportunity of great enterprise systems. But that's starting to swing, and so people are starting to come and say, "Hey, how can we be part of this?" And maybe want to speak to IMET. I think that could certainly dramatically improve capital over time.
Sure. So it's a good question, because we're both thinking about how to grow and what our future obstacles are. I'll say the outlook is actually very good. So we are the company that we are today because we've been able to capitalize on the infrastructure that's here. Specifically, wet laboratory space with sinks and fume hoods. Specifically, a community that's very good at manufacturing, which we leverage in terms of some of the things that we make for our own use and then we sell. So I'm here largely because of the infrastructure that has been here, and frankly, the cooperative spirit that ties it, which as I travel more and more, I realize it's not something you can take for granted. So I think necessity is the mother of invention, if you will. And so that kind of spirit, I think, permeates our ecosystem. And as a result, things kind of, when there's a need that arises, there is a solution that comes from the cooperation. So I guess without saying anything that's not been in the paper already, there's an intention to, ramp up the infrastructure around the medical community and around here. And we're going to benefit from that, frankly. I'll say that's a great answer to have to questions about our future growth. Is to say we live in a vibrant community that has a plan, a declared plan to invest in this kind of infrastructure. And I don't know if it makes me good or bad, but I'm going to try to continue to leverage that to grow the company and get more people here. So, good question.
Just Google IMED, I-M-E-D.
Another question I saw?
I do.
I guess my question would be for Dr. Thomas. I know you spoke on, the very small percentage of the clinical trial for newly diagnosed patients. Do you think that's because of the availability of the clinical trial, or because of their, I guess, maybe not wanting to be tested on?
So It's not a small number of trials. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of trials that are open across the United States. It's the percentage of, so if there's 500,000 new people diagnosed with cancer every year, that's only about 3 or 4% of those people who are going on trials. So there are lots of reasons, yes. There's, and much of it, and there's actually been lots of studies about what are the barriers to putting patients on trials, and one of the main ones is actually physicians. I mean, it's been shown, countless times of because people, individuals rely on their doctor, especially in oncology, of course, is they're giving you a treatment, set of treatment options. There's standard care, there's this, and there's a trial that might be appropriate for you, or there's a trial at, second-line therapy. The bulk of the oncology physicians don't do the best job at communicating that. Really, that's the first thing. And then probably, fears of being, quote, experimented on, and, just barriers about many patients don't, they're the deer in the headlights to begin with, dealing with a diagnosis of cancer and probably not knowing how to ask and so forth. So there's a number of things, but a lot of it is just information, people not being really aware.
Can I follow up on that? Sure. So I came out of the pharmaceutical industry before I started my first company in 2006. And we made contract manufactured molecules for support of big clinical trials. So you get phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and launch. And as you go along, you get more and more people, it becomes more and more expensive, and a huge number of drugs will fail typically in phase 2, phase 2B, right?
60% or something.
Just an amazing amount of money was just down a hole. Well, the challenge that we are now starting to address, and that you have to commend the FDA for, is don't do a clinical trial that's just it's just population. Give us a specific idea of the operating mechanism for your drug and develop what's called a companion diagnostic to prove that the patients you're going to put it on are likely to be more susceptible to the positive outcome, right? We've never done that. I mean, I don't think we've ever done that before. And we're now starting to do that. So there is a hope. And so being tested on when you're being guided to a trial based on, and I'll speak to my interest, based on your genetic signature, the drug is specifically set to go after those folks that can take advantage of that molecule. So the way your body operates in no small part is because of the way your genes tell your body to operate. And ultimately it translates to proteomics and the whole 9 yards. But if you don't have the mechanism in your genetics to take advantage of the drug, you don't want to be on that clinical trial, bar none.
We have time for one last question if we could. Please.
Being a cancer survivor, I was curious because when I was diagnosed with breast cancer, they actually told me the type and that they had done the some genetic testing, and they asked me to donate tissue as part of the research and everything. Are we just not there with colon cancer? Or I guess I'm curious as to why, I understand why you guys would be interested. You obviously have some history with it, but is it just breast cancer so much further along?
It's such a great question. Yes, largely in part it's further along because unfortunately it's so common. So, it's the leading cause of cancer in women in the United States, 240-some thousand new cases. So when you have something that's more common, it's much easier to do a lot of research on it. Plus it's a tumor that it's been very easy to, get tissue and get good size and quality of tissue. So over the last at least decade, sites really across the country and the NCI have done a lot with saving tissue from biopsies and surgical specimens and archiving them and studying them. I would say that a lot of that work though has been sort of for traditional pathology, not what these gentlemen are talking about. So just but and so many of the factors that probably influence what you should go on with these very, very large clinical trials and large specimen banks, they're able to then, using informatics, kind of go back and look at, all right, well, your tumor in its basic histology looks like these 2,000 other, specimens that did respond to one drug and didn't respond to another. I would say that era was kind of the first generation of co-personalized therapy. But now we're even further along, and not just its histological properties, but its actual genetic profile.
Yeah, because I had gone on Herceptin, which which was
Well,
specifically
I mean,
targeted.
that's right.
And
So-
it was still coming out, and at the time, I still had to do the chemo with it, but that's why I was
Right.
curious, so.
So her,
If you-
go
Colon
ahead.
cancer is still at that.
If you would, this is actually a very good.
This is perfect discussion of this.
Yes,
Yeah.
good example. And so breast cancer is out in front as far as their ability to treat different kinds of breast cancer with different drugs. And so, you know, there used to be about 3 major subtypes, and then your drugs were either hormonally oriented or chemotherapy or Herceptin, depending on whether you had markers that qualified. However, having said that, so everyone who has the marker for Herceptin and gets it,
Which is
does-
only about 25% of women with breast cancer have that gene amplification that Herceptin will work.
So-
So it's
so we-
still a small number.
So we take 100 patients, 25 of them have the marker for Herceptin and get it. But only, I think anecdotal data I've got, about 30% would respond to Herceptin alone.
Right.
And then about 40% more respond to Herceptin and chemo together. And then 30% still don't respond. And so we're still, even though we have some markers and we have somewhat guided our drug selection, we still have 40%, or basically 30% who are still not responding. And then 30% who got chemo and didn't need it. And so there's a tremendous room to even select for those and create better outcomes there. And I will say, I don't know if this is the last comment, but an area of hope is to say, this is actually what we're being funded by the National Cancer Institute to research right here in Greenville using live tissue that we get, is to see can we differentiate and ultimately answer those kinds of questions, which is who needs Herceptin because they'll respond to it. And by the way, Herceptin's an expensive drug too.
Yes. It's
Who
been around
needs
for over 15 years now,
Yeah,
and it's
and-
still expensive.
who needs it and chemo because it's going to be worth the extra side effects, and then who needs something else? And that's the world that we really want to get to.
Sometimes we think only the greatest things are going to happen in our biggest cities. But the point is that we are a region of small towns and big cities, and we're all working together through the efforts of 10 at the Top, and great things are happening. So thank you all very much. As we wrap up today's program, I want to call your attention to some upcoming programs. But before I do, let me thank again Thornton Kirby, Jim Shue, Angel Rodriguez, and all of our panelists for their insights and their great work they are doing to make the upstate a leading place when it comes to healthcare and innovation. Let's give them all a hand.